Obviously skill matters in Star Rail, but I wondered what would this difference actually look like exactly. The best way to tackle this question is probably to get two players of different skill levels to play with the same team, the same relics, and on the same stage. But that is kinda hard to do, so I settled for the next best, comparing my rotations versus autoplay. My logic is that if somebody's bad at the game, chances are they will be using autoplay, which would probably mean auto is the lowest baseline for skill. I mean, it's probably quite hard to play worse than auto. So from here, I looked at 5 different simulations to get a better understanding. Prior to this, I thought Mono Remembrance was one of the hardest to play teams because there are a ton of micro decisions that can increase your damage slightly, so that was what I looked at first. There aren't a lot of good stages to test on, so I'll be using Swamp Nightmare mostly, and the auto run actually plays pretty well until Siren's ultimate, but afterwards, and I noticed this a lot with auto, it just uses the ultimate whenever it's available. So it used Hyacinth and Evanescia's ultimate again even during Castor's first ultimate, which means she gets no charges, and by ulting instantly with Evanescia, it misses out on Evie using its whirling attack for 5 extra Memoria, and also causes Evie to hit 16 stacks, so again, more charges for Castor's is wasted. From here, Auto again uses Castor's ult instantly, even before Swamp Nightmare can summon the extra mobs, and against this boss, you want to let it summon, and then deal with those mobs ASAP because it gives a vulnerability debuff to the boss, so you can deal a lot more damage. And another weird thing I also noticed with Auto is that even though it activates the ult whenever it's up, it can only do so on the first character's action when it's the start of a new wave, and not at 0 action value. And hence why it's Hyacinth's turn during Castor's ultimate, which again wastes even more charges for her. I have E2 Castor's, so she can still one-shot the summons, but the lost charges from before show here at the end of the rotation. Even with Hyacinth's skill and ultimate, Castor's cannot get the last ultimate to 0 cycle to stage. So now let's compare that to how I played it. The first difference is even before Siren's ultimate. I save Hyacinth out for after Evanescia's ultimate, so it deals slightly more damage, and I then let Evie take a turn for that 5 Memoria, and afterwards I ult with Hyacinth, giving Evie 16 stacks, so it 100% advances, but I interrupt it by using Castor's ultimate. Now before Castor's can deal her damage, I use Siren's ult to buff the team, and then I deal the damage. I'm not going to use Evanescia or Hyacinth's ultimate since I already have enough investment to clear the wave with just one more Castor's ultimate. This also gives me some free damage on the boss on wave 2, but it doesn't matter too much. What matters is that I save Castor's ult for when the boss summons the swamp, so I can deal with those ASAP. Since it gives a 100% action advance, I can actually use the skill once before ulting for even more charges, and after one-shotting the wave, Evie finally gets its turn at 55 Memoria, and I quickly use her ultimate before Evanescia's turn, for again 5 free Memoria. I also use Siren's ult in between for more stacks, but I actually use the ultimate on Hyacinth, so that she has enough energy at the end of the rotation. Because I didn't waste pretty much any Castor's charge, I gave Evie extra turns, and I regenerated enough energy for Hyacinth. Both Siren and Castor's have their ultimates again, and I very comfortably 0 cycle the stage with a ton of damage to spare. So tallying up the damage and action value, my rotation did almost 30,000 more damage per action value. It's a really huge amount actually. It just looks pretty small percentage wise here because I have E2 Castor's and Siren, so the baseline is quite high already. In this rotation, I kinda just blasted the stage without thinking too much about it, but if you've watched my showcases, you'd know you usually want to hold back your damage a bit early on to save your resources for the usually much harder second wave. So next, I tried out a rotation with Evanescia where I do exactly that. At this point, usually what you want to do is to save your buffs for when Evanescia locks in her turn, so that not only do the buffs last longer for her, she also keeps Certified Banger for longer. It's a pretty cool trick to save uptime and usually very important for units like Saber or the other Elation units, Silver Wolf and Sparksy. Anyways, instead of waiting for the Aha instant from Yao Gong's ultimate, I just buffer Evanescia's ult so that I can reduce the damage it deals, and I then use it immediately again after Elation MC's ult, before Hua Hua, and finally I basic attack instead of skilling, so the Aha instant doesn't clear the wave too quickly. This will waste some action value, but it allows Elation MC to get the kill on their second turn before Evanescia, so she saves a ton of certified bangers and the team also regenerates some energy. Again, I wait for Swamp Nightmare to summon the mobs, and then I use Evanescia's ultimate even if I waste some energy. Now I actually play it properly and use both buffs on Evanescia's turn before ulting, which lets me hit at 1000 plus certified bangers, and even after this turn, she only loses about 300 stacks, dropping to 667. Whereas for the autoplay, since they use their outs instantly and don't save uptime on the bangers, Evanescia drops from 938 to 386 stacks, obviously a much larger drop. The other big mistake from the auto rotation is that they completely overkilled wave 1, and hence Evanescia loses one whole ultimate in the long run, which is why it takes one cycle to clear the stage, whereas I again completely overkilled the boss and comfortably zero cycled the stage. Mathematically, this is slightly less than a 20% damage difference and still fairly close to that mono remembrance comparison. This is because even though I wasted some action value on the first wave to regenerate the energy, I clear faster on wave 2, and hence the action value used is still very close, only 4 action value longer. You may think it's quite weird that I took longer on the zero cycle, but that is just how it works in Star Rail. It's always better to save your resources for the harder wave 2, and this can help you clear the stage faster in terms of cycles, even if it takes longer in terms of action value. The next two comparisons are Mortenax Blade and Phainon, because I thought these teams would be easier to play, so perhaps the difference with these teams could be smaller than what we have found so far, and I was actually wrong. Using the ultimates early isn't that bad for the Mortenax Blade team. The biggest issue that they ran into actually is that they chose Ashville to deal with the summons, even though Mortenax Blade obviously has much better AoE damage. So for my rotation, I pretty much one-shot the summons because I held Blade's ultimate, so I get two ultimates back to back, whereas the auto rotation took forever to clear it out, because only Ashville was dealing crit damage to the swarm. Again, I did stall a bit on wave 1 to be more prepared for wave 2, but choosing Ashville took so much longer that even though I stalled my rotation, I still took a shorter amount of time to clear the stage as compared to the auto rotation, and the difference in damage was much larger this time, again because it picked Ashville instead of Mortenax. Hence, knowing how to play the team isn't enough, learning to play around the boss mechanics can also matter a lot, and that's probably the biggest contributor to the huge damage difference of 47%, even though it's still only a one cycle difference like the Evanescia or Mono Remembrance comparison. Next we have Phainon, and he has the easiest to play team in the entire game, but the auto rotation didn't give Phainon the RMC buff for some reason, even though it was literally zero action value. And the cherry on top is that it kept trying to counter against the Storm Nightmare. I think the auto is just coded to counter versus AoE and basic versus low target, which is usually correct, but with this boss, if they get a certain number of attacks off, the boss actually heals back its health, and the auto rotation actually counted 4 times, meaning the boss also healed a lot of health back. For my rotation, I didn't have enough damage to stop it from healing once, but I was still able to clear out the summons much faster, resulting in a 2 cycle difference and a 40% damage difference. I thought maybe the autoplay just doesn't really work when it comes to Storm Nightmare, so I tried again with Perfection, because there is literally no different decision to make. You just Stardeath, counter, but again, the auto rotation does not give Phainon the buffs from Mem, which resulted in my rotation dealing much more damage, but a closer score, 27,000 for the auto and about 31,000 for mine. I think it mattered a bit less here in terms of the end result, but the damage in Pure Fiction is also quite inflated, so I think that's why the difference in damage looks bigger here, but normally it shouldn't be that big if it was Memory of Chaos or something like that. So far the difference ranges from 20 to about 50%, but this is for kinda general stages where these stage mechanics don't really matter too much. Because there are some Apocalyptic Shadow stages that can be quite gimmicky, like you really need to understand the mechanics to clear it quickly, like the current Flame Reaver stage. So if you have not played it, it basically gives you extra turns if you kill the purple glowing clone, so you can kinda just get a bajillion turns, and you can do ridiculous infinitely looping stuff with Evanescia for example. In my rotation, I save the action advance for when the Flame Reaver summons the mobs, and then I apply Siren's buff, and then I go crazy. This lets me keep the buffs even after Flame Reaver is broken, because it's extra turns, which is why Evanescia does so much damage here, and this lets me save the action advanced turns for the second phase. Whereas for the auto rotation, again it uses the ultimates early, so it misses out on the first purple clone, but it still manages to chain together some turns slightly later, but without Siren's buff, Evanescia doesn't deal enough damage, so the team tanks the huge attack from Flame Reaver on phase 1, and then they waste even more time trying to get to phase 2. This kind of snowballs, or I don't know, reverse snowballs into a slower and slower clear, which eventually results in the team being one-shot by Flame Reaver. Since I did the infinite loop with Evanescia, the DPAV naturally looks incredibly stupid at 440,000 with a 3,933 score, so almost perfect, whereas the auto rotation had 36,000 TPV and a very sad 1,300 score because they couldn't even complete the stage. So in stages like this that require a better understanding as compared to Memory of Chaos or Pure Fiction, the difference can increase even further and be really massive. Overall, the difference in gameplay between mine and the auto rotation usually ranged from 20 to 50%, but I think the 40 to 50% differences are usually because the auto rotation does not take into account the boss mechanics. So in the rotations where that doesn't matter as much, like for Castris or Evanescia where it's kind of like punching bag scenarios or bosses like Kafka or Hule, it was usually around a 20% difference. However, this 20% difference is usually equivalent to 1 or 2 extra cost. So I still think even in these rare punching bag scenarios, the difference is still quite significant, because it means you can save on 1 or 2 5-star characters or light cones, which can be 140 or 280 plus pulls if you get unlucky. Obviously a huge difference, especially for free-to-play players. And in the NXR rotation, we can see it can get even worse depending on the stage. 1,000+% difference. Like you might have to E6 your characters in auto just to make up for that kind of difference in gameplay. If it was only a 5 to 10% difference, I think learning to play the game better wouldn't have been very important. But a 20% difference as the baseline is definitely pretty massive, especially when considering the significance of it. Personally, I think this is definitely a good reason to stop autoing your runs, especially for endgame content. Sure, the difference in Jades you earn may not be as much, but over time it definitely can add up. So why not try to learn to play the game better? It doesn't cost anything other than your time and effort after all. Of course, if you play slightly better than auto, the difference in your rotation as compared to mine would have been smaller, but at the same time, it will be easier for you to continue improving as compared to a new player leaning on auto, learning the game for the first time. But in this video, I've already added some explanations and tips on why these rotations work better, and I have a ton of gameplay videos detailing the thought process and why the runs work, so you can watch some of those if you like to learn more. But of course, if this video gets enough traction, I might make a separate video giving extra general tips to play the game better, probably more catered towards newer players. So if you like that, be sure to comment or better yet, like the video. But as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.